Good morning, everyone. For those of you that are following us from the East Coast, and good evening for those of you who are following us from the European side, Italy in particular. I am Karim Isran. I am the Senior Fellow for North Africa at the Rafik Hariri Center at the Middle Eastern Programs at the Atlantic Council. And I am the lead of this new project focused on Italy that we have been launching in these last few weeks, and of which this event is one part of it. I have to say a few words of gratitude and thank you for not only for the directors of the European Center and of the Middle East Center, respectively Jorn Fleck and Will Wexler, for having worked together in giving birth to this initiative. But I have a few words to say to really thank, and I'm very grateful to the proximity and the help and the support that we have always received from the Italian embassy in Washington, D.C., especially from Her Excellency, the Ambassador Maria Angela Zappia, her deputy, Alessandro Gonzalez, and the Political Affairs Director, Andrea Catano. And all the staff, they've been really marvelous in helping us and supporting us to the farthest extreme. There's a group of people, moreover, that I have to thank. I call them patriots, because they are people that out of their support, they're not getting anything except the knowledge they are helping their country and the whole system to progress. In particular, I'm grateful to Paolo Messa of Leonardo, to Marco Margheri of ENI, to Francesco Valente Stefanitri of Beretta, to Fede Broccardo of BVTech, and many others that it will be too long to quote here. Having said that, let's get to this panel, which is going to be extremely interesting, and we have some very, very special speakers, people that will nuance the situation the way we see it, and I'm sure we will raise many questions from you. We have quite a wide number, large number of viewers today, so I'm expecting quite a large number of questions. I will proceed like this. I will ask each one of you a question to begin with, and then we will see if there is time for a second round of questions, or we go directly to those who are coming from the web and then ask those. Whatever is going to be most difficult for you, we will do. Very quickly, we have 4 excellent speakers. I would like to introduce all 4 of them together, so that then we just go on with the questions. Have Roberto. Let's begin with Dario Cristiani. Dario Cristiani, he was a resident senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Where he works on Italian foreign policy, the Mediterranean, and global politics. We then have Alessia Melcangi. Alessia Melcangi is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, but more important than all, is an associate professor for contemporary history of North Africa and the Middle East at the Department of Social Science and Economics at the Sapienza University of Rome. She's an associate of the ISPI and a member of the scientific committee of the Fondazione Medor Leonardo in Rome. Following, we have Roberto Menotti, who is the editor-in-chief of Aspenia Online, deputy editor of Aspenia, senior advisor for international activities of the Aspenia Institute in Italy. Roberto is one of the main experts of international relations in Italy, and we are very fortunate to have him here as well. Last but definitely not least, we have our own Rachel Rizzo, who is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council Europe Center. Her research focuses on European security, NATO, and the transatlantic relationship. Prior to joining the Atlantic Council, she served as the director of programs at the Truman Center, and a long list of publications follow, which I will leave you to those who are interested to check on our website, and you'll find for each one of them. Probably is a huge curriculum. I cannot go on. Now, I would like to start with Roberto, if that's okay, to ask you an introductory question, which is the reason why we organize this center. This is what is going on in the wider Mediterranean in the last few, maybe a year, maybe more, maybe less. It's still an open question whenever we decide. Are the positions and the actions of the various of the superpowers really determining this continuous shift, this continuous strange things that we are seeing, or is the contrary? Are these regional smaller powers that take advantage of what's going on in the internal field and push for a re-equilibrate, rebalance their own positions?
Thank you very much, Karim, and the Atlantic Council for the invitation and the opportunity. I would start with the very short answer, and then I'll try to articulate it a little more and to expand. The short answer is, I think most of the changes we're seeing, or the dynamics we're seeing, are actually very local. And I think it's a good thing. In a way, I think since, I mean, if we can go back to 2011, in fact, the region as a whole has been left more and more to its own dynamics, not really to its own devices, because that wouldn't be fair. There's been major interference by regional powers, global powers, and so on. So what I'm saying is, it's not as if the region is left to itself, but the local dynamics have become much more important than before, it seems to me. Let me start with the role of the United States, where I believe my position over the past few years has been slightly different from, let's say, from the mainstream, perhaps, in the sense that I believe the United States, since the Obama administration, so several years ago, in fact, has started to not really retrench or disentangle or disengage from the region. I think not at all. What we've seen, it seems to me, is a reorientation of the priorities, which is something very different. To be even more explicit, it seems to me that, to oversimplify a bit, the United States, as under the Obama administration, and again now under the Biden administration, with the parenthesis of a very chaotic Trump administration, which is extremely hard to assess, even now after a few years. But let's say Obama administration, 2 administrations, plus 2 mandates, plus Biden ongoing, what we've seen, I think, is a sort of decision to become less dependent to decisions made in Saudi Arabia, in Israel, and in Egypt. 3 countries, and I'm picking these 3 countries clearly because of the major role they've had in the past decades as pillars of US policies toward the entire region. Obama did it for his own reasons, post-Iraq, let's say, thinking that Iraq had been a huge mistake. I mean, Iraq 2003, of course. Then making a very bold decision on Iran, 2015, which had consequences for example, relations with Israel, quite clearly, because the priorities were shifting from Washington's viewpoint. And again, I know, Karim, you know a lot more than I do about this. Libya, in the case of Libya, for example, what I've seen as a European, as an Italian and as a European, is certainly not an American decision to intervene, but much, much more clearly a European request for American support for what would have been a European intervention, which would have been impossible without US help. But Obama was clear from the very beginning that the United States was not making a commitment to post-Gaddafi Libya, one way or the other, that this would be a European responsibility. And that is, you know, the basis of a lot of misunderstandings regarding Libya, I think, across the Atlantic. Now, I'm saying this about the United States because I think it helps us, you know, set the framework. Of course, I may be wrong in my analysis, but if the analysis is even half right, I think what we have is a very different set of dynamics. Because once you take the United States off the table as a direct initiator of change, then the local dynamics become much more important. And to finish on this, I would add, of course, that yes, there has been an influence by countries we know, like Russia, like Turkey, like Egypt itself, and of course, the Gulf monarchies. But in no single case, I think the outside influences being the one factor determining outcomes by itself. So I would say the local dynamics need to be followed much more closely than in the past.
Great, very well. Alessia, let's talk about the Piano Mattei. This elephant in the room that has been launched by Prime Minister Meloni as her main political asset. But before talking about what could be the Piano Mattei, I would like you to explain what you think, why there was a need to launch a Piano Mattei. What is within the Italian political system establishment that resorted to such a brilliant, in my opinion, but also heavy marketing and political idea?
Thank you very much, Karim, for inviting me to this interesting event. And let me thank the Atlantic Council, the European Center, and the North Africa Center for organizing it. In order to try to answer to your complex question, I think that we should adopt a multi-layer answer because the proposal by Giorgia Meloni, the Italian Prime Minister, is to answer and to speak to different audience. So there is a first level that is the domestic one. And of course, we know that the Italian public opinion is scared and worried both by migration and by the fear of scarcity of natural gas energy resources. And so the proposed Piano Mattei is a sort of attempt to deal with them. Also because when Giorgia Meloni was the leader of opposition before becoming prime minister, she was extremely vocal. And the question of security and migration was a strong argument in her political campaign. I don't think in this event we have to focus on the domestic aspect of the Italian policy, of course, which is another aspect of. But I think it's important now to underline the international aspect. So at an international level, which represent my second level of analysis, I think we have to distinguish and differentiate between two different cote. So the first one, the Italian government is trying to address the European Union and the European member state regarding the importance of the Mediterranean, North African countries, Africa, vis-a-vis the European security and European stability. And it is not a mystery that Italy sometimes felt to be left alone by the other European state members on several issues, mainly on migration, but not only. And it is moreover clear that the perception of the European Mediterranean countries is that the frontier of the East, especially after the outbreak of the Ukraine war, are absorbing all the interests and the resources by Europe. It is clear also that even before the Ukraine war, with the failure of the so-called Arab Spring and the failure of the Barcelona process, Europe withdrew from an active posture and policy toward Mediterranean and Africa. And that was a mistake made by Europe, which opened the gate for other actors to increase their grip in this region. So that is the desire of Italy to press Europe to play a more active role in the Mediterranean. I think that with this proposal that is in the making, Giorgia Meloni is trying to rebalance it, to put once again on the desk of the European Commission the importance of the Mediterranean, as demonstrated, for example, by the various visits made in Tunisia together with the President of the European Commission, von der Leyen. Recently, just a few days ago, we had this important agreement trying to announce European relation with Tunisia on cooperation, economy, migration. So in some way, I think that Giorgia Meloni's advocacy of the importance of the Mediterranean is going through at least a formal level in the European Union. The second cote of the European level of Piano Mattei is trying to engage the African and North African state, proposing Italy like a credible, suitable main actor of cooperation and stabilization. But why Piano Mattei? Obviously, one can say that when Enrico Mattei, the genius founder of ENA, oil company, launched the Piano Mattei for Africa, it was still mainly under the control of Western state, a colony of Europe. And of course, we are in a totally different context. We are not in the 50s of the last century, but what is important in the vision Mattei had like the formula Mattei. Mattei carried out a sort of Copernican revolution of the oil contract and the relation with the oil producers. He proposed a new form of redistribution based on equality and cooperation. And this was a change in the way the Western oil company were dealing with oil producers. So in this way, the name Mattei might underline the desire of a new form of cooperation without the perception of patronizing the past European project had toward African countries. It's not a mystery that often African, North African states felt this patronizing attitude by the European Commission, such as, we give you support for development, you have to adopt, you have to listen, you have to teach the importance of human rights, etc. This is something that did not working in the past, and there is a need of a new approach. Obviously, and I'm going to finish my contribute. Piano Mattei is a multi-layered, ambitious, long-term project, is a sort of trigger of change in different fields. So Italy has neither the financial nor the human capacity to launch such an ambitious project alone. The Piano Mattei has not the possibility of success, but as an European program. Only Europe has financial, human resources, technical capacities to support such a long-term project. But of course, it has to change the mechanism of the last Barcelona program and last North-South collaboration.
Thank you very much, Essie. That's a very important point, because I was, on the other hand, more convinced that it was the attempt for Italy to try to lead something by utilizing its own resources. So you think that the Italian political system, the Italian economic system are not able to function alone in this area. They need the support of Europe. Perfectly legitimate. Then let's ask the same, something similar to Dario Cristiani. Let's go on the other side then. Let's see what is happening in North Africa. What are the main dynamics that may affect Italy's security and decisions in this respect? And do you agree with Alessia that Italy doesn't have the capacity and the political will to take these difficulties by herself and needs multilateral or European support? Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me here today. And yes, indeed, I do agree with the last point made by Alessia regarding, I wouldn't really say, I wouldn't say the incapacity of Italy to act alone, but, you know, I think we sometimes tend to forget how, like in the past, many European countries have used the European community first and the European community and the European Union as amplifiers of their foreign policy approach. I think, you know, we can criticize significantly the entire project behind the Barcelona process and the Euro-Mediterranean partnership, but I think that one was a very good example of how a newcomer like Spain in the European institutions, because Spain joined just in the late 80s, was able to use the European community as an element to amplify a foreign policy goal, which was to have a project for the Mediterranean. Then it was a project launched in the mid-90s where there was this sort of, let's say, liberal obsession and this idea that liberal democracy was the only possible, let's say, solution and outcome for any political transition. Then, of course, when discussing the Euro-Mediterranean partnership, we should also discuss the differences that were extremely significant between the rhetoric and the project and the practices, especially after 9/11. And let's not forget that just 6 months before the beginning of the Jasmine Revolution in Tunisia, the European Union was granting the regime of Ben Ali the status of advanced partner to reward Ben Ali for the reforms he made. So from that point of view, there is also there was this element that I think the fact itself that Italy wants to do something named after Enrico Mattei is a sort of like response to this, in the sense that the idea is that a real partnership involved the shared agency and not the patronizing attitude that in many cases the Europeans used to have. But compared to the situation in the 90s, I think the local dimension is extremely more fragmented and complicated, as Roberto was saying before. And I think this is also partially the result of the increasing relevance that many other actors have in the region. If we look at the launch of the Barcelona process, like Russia in that period was not as present both in the Mediterranean and Africa. China was focusing on domestic development after Tiananmen and was struggling to return into the international markets. Turkey was going through a massive economic crisis, domestic problems linked to the Kurdish to guerrilla, and a significant degree of political fragmentation, and also Gulf countries were not as present as they are now. Instead, the current situation has way more variables that both European countries, but also local actors must take into account, and can also be used by local actors to advance their agendas. If we look at the history of Libya over the past 10 years, of course, the interest of foreign countries and actors played like a role in like the competition, but local agents and local actors in Libya were extremely skilled in using these differences in order to advance their local goals. Just let's look at how different groups in Libya used the Italian-French rivalry inside the European Union to actually advance their agendas. And I think from this point of view, the rise of Khalifa Haftar is an extremely good example of how these dynamics play at the local level. So to summarize, the situation that Italy is facing these days in North Africa is a situation characterized by increasing fragmentation, both at the domestic level inside each country, but also from a broader geopolitical perspective. Just look at the tense relations between Morocco and Algeria in the aftermath of Rabat joining the Abraham Accords. Or let's look at the impact of the Russian war of aggression in Ukraine from a food security perspective, that for many of the countries in North Africa, this dimension is extremely significant. Just look at how Egypt or Tunisia depend on the import of wheat and other foodstuff from Russia and Ukraine, but also, I would say, by other elements that this war has somehow highlighted. We all are aware of the presence of Wagner, even if Wagner these days, is even more peculiar than it used to be as an actor. But let's not forget how Russia, for instance, is using not only in North Africa, but on the entire continent, its religious appeal. There is this sort of like instrumental use of religion by Russia to make inroads into Africa, and this is also happening in North Africa, following the problems that there have been inside the Orthodox world, etc. And in this context, I think the dynamics of the past few years, especially the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, helped to cementify a return of a significant degree of authoritarianism. Of course, the Tunisian case is the most visible, although in the case of Tunisia, I think we need to stress one element, which is that after July 25th, 2021, of course, the democratic transition of Tunisia has somehow, I don't want to say finished, but it has experienced some significant problems. But in the case of Tunisia, I think there is a civil society which is still capable of like bringing democracy back in the country at some point. I think instead it's very relevant how the pandemic has concurred to the marginalization of the Iraq movement in Algeria, and how also the pandemic has helped to strengthen the return of the military on the scene in Algeria, but also in Tunisia. And Tunisia, from this point of view, is an extremely interesting case because of the countries of the region. Tunisia is the country that historically has had, like, the presence of the military was not particularly significant. Instead, like, it was the military at some point that handled the vaccination campaign, the second and the third wave of the pandemic. Tunisia was able to go through thanks to the support provided by the military. And also we have seen that the regime of Kais Saied, like, losing part of its historical constituencies, has become more and more reliant on that. So to conclude, I think Italy is facing like a regional picture in North Africa, which is way more fragmented than it used to be. This fragmentation is both the result of specific local dynamics, but also the presence of a greater, let's say, multilateral, not like competition, or in any case, presence that increase the number of variables, but also the number of actors that can actually provide support for local actors. And then there is an increasing, like, there is a rising geopolitical, more than rising, because if we look at the history of Algeria and Morocco, this geopolitical competition has always been there. But I think the Abraham Accords, from this point of view, while representing like a positive step overall in the sense of the attempt to normalize relations between Israel and Arab countries, although let's not forget that the Abraham Accords have one big problem, which is excluding the Palestinians from this picture. So let's not forget this element. But the Abraham Accords in North Africa created, like, gave the impression that there was a significant presence for Morocco, and this has created like a backlash with Algeria and has increased like the competition and the tension between the two major powers of the Maghreb. Then we should make a discussion specific about Egypt, but I don't really think we have time now for that, but maybe we can address this later during the question and answer session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dario. Just one thing, very briefly, what do you think about this rapprochement hypothetical with Egypt? Will it play an important role, or is it just simply an event in and of itself?
Rapprochement with Egypt between...
You know, they say that the fact that the Egyptian president came out and graced Zaki right away, people are saying, is there an agreement with the Italians? Is there an agreement with overpassing the Regeni situation? Will it lead to undoubtedly a closer relationship between Italy and Egypt would be extremely important in the area?
Well, I mean, I'm about to say something extremely banal, but the centrality of Egypt in any like discussion on the geopolitics of the Mediterranean, I think, is granted. In the case of the release of Patrick Zaki and other prisoners, I think there are different elements that we need to take into consideration. So, of course, there is an international dimension, and from this point of view, I'm surprised that some people in Italy were blaming the government until 2 days ago for the situation of Patrick Zaki, and now instead they completely deny a role from that point of view. The role of Italy, there has been a role of the United States as well. Over the past year here in DC, there have been in some cases they were not that visible, but in the case of Patrick Zaki, his case was seen as a proof of some of the problems existing in Egypt with religious freedom and the role of the Copts. So from this point of view, there is also this element of pressure. And I think yesterday on social media, we've seen different American voices, politicians, etc., that came out in support of this release. But then there is also an internal dimension, which I think is in part connected also with the attempt of the Al-Sisi regime to, I think at some point, reality, especially economic realities, bite hard to autocrats. So they can have the foreign, they can have the assertive foreign policy they want, but then if there are economic problems, especially those countries that need external support, they have to find solutions. So I think the national dialogue that Al-Sisi launched, that Egypt has launched recently, I think in May, despite all the problems, despite the fact that it might be cosmetic in many cases, that issues like foreign policy, national security problems are not being discussed, etc. At the same time, is part of this attempt by the regime to show to external partners that the criticism it has received over the past years regarding political prisoners, the lack of fundamental freedom, repression, etc., it's trying to do something about that. Then, whether this national dialogue will actually solve all the Egyptian problems, I think it's questionable. But I see the release of Patrick Zaki and other prisoners in this framework, and we are all happy for the outcome. But let's not forget that this is just the tip of the iceberg, and there are many more political prisoners in Egypt that need to be freed. And Egypt is a country that, Egypt is actually that country that if it crash economically or has significant issue, can actually create problems to the entire region both ways, in the Maghreb, but also in the Mashrek.
It will be a black hole that will attract everything.
Yeah, so
thank you
from that point of view, I think
we have
to without the ambition of teaching lessons to Mediterranean partners, because the Europeans are not in that condition anymore. But I think we should really understand that with all the problems, engaging with Egypt and avoiding that Egypt collapse or has significant problem is one of those interests that goes beyond the the short term, and it's part a structurally stable Mediterranean is stable just if Egypt is stable. Then autocracies, we know well that sometimes are stable in the short.
Dario, sorry, I have to stop.
Yeah.
Pass to, we got a second round. Yeah, chance later on. We have to continue. And Rachel, with you, I'd like to widen the spectrum and talk about Italy's strange relation that we had, the relation with China, which now become the boogeyman of the situation. Up to the point that thus far is the only G7 group country to sign the Beijing Belt and Road Initiative. But now, because after the Iraqi situation, the Italians have been put almost in a corner. They have to get out of it, or find a way to continue to work with the Chinese while making the Americans happy that they think they can rely on their ally. It's a very complicated and a very complex situation. How do you see it? How do you think it is perceived by Washington, really, this state of affairs?
So I think, more broadly, just looking at how crowded the Mediterranean has become. I mean, it covers 1% of the world's ocean surface, but carries 20% of the world's maritime traffic. And that's just talking about economics, right? I mean, it's also seen as NATO's southern flank. So you have this intersection between security and economics that makes the Mediterranean region one of immense strategic importance, not just for Europe and the United States, but for China as well. And we've seen that happen with greater Chinese activity in the region, not just with European countries like the state-owned company Costco purchasing the port of Piraeus in 2016, but also working with countries like Algeria to build and develop the port of El Hamdania, which is going to become the second biggest deep water port in Africa. And so you see Chinese strategic influence in the Mediterranean and using countries like Italy and Greece as members of both NATO and the European Union to, I think, deepen their relationships both throughout the Mediterranean and throughout Europe as well. The US role here, I think, is fascinating because China and the Indo-Pacific region is basically the lens through which this administration views both its foreign and domestic policy. Now, you might say to yourself, but wait a minute, the US has led an international coalition on supporting Ukraine in the last year, and that's true, but don't let that fool you. The strategic focus of the United States is very much still on and will continue to be on countering China and focusing on US presence in the Indo-Pacific region. So if you look at just some of the US legislation that's been championed in the United States over the last year, you have the CHIPS and Science Act, which provides almost $300 billion to boost domestic research and manufacturing of semiconductors in the US. And you have the IRA, which again aims to revitalize US economy so that at the end of the day, we can counter China. So I always say that in a very polarized America, the one foreign policy issue that really unites the Democrats and Republicans is hawkishness towards China. And I think that's an important lens to understand this context when thinking about how the US deals with European countries like Italy in their bilateral relationships with China. I think for the US, it's important to understand that there's likely never going to be a unified European China strategy. There isn't going to be a scenario where Europe is going to pick one side over the other. It's US or China. But I think what this broader geopolitical power struggle has done, especially with countries like Italy, who are really grappling with their future relationship with China, especially when it comes to the Belt and Road Initiative, is created a scenario where certain choices will always be seen as a binary. And this is very much happening with BRI as well. You're already seeing Chinese state media talking about US pressure on Italy. China has been trying to do this diplomatic push to get Italy to stay signed on to the Belt and Road Initiative. The US has stayed largely silent in all of this, but as we know, Giorgia Meloni is coming to Washington next week to meet with Biden, and among many other things, Italy's future involvement with the Belt and Road Initiative is going to be at the top of this conversation. So I think it's something that all of us are really going to be watching closely. We can get into this a little bit more if you want, but we've seen how China reacts to countries that push back against accepted norms in the relationship between the West and China, namely with regards to Taiwan. I'm thinking about Lithuania specifically. So I think one of the worries about Italy and for Meloni, of course, is what China's response will be to an Italian withdrawal from the Belt and Road Initiative. And so I think how the US plays into that and how that discussion evolves around Italy and the United States is going to be one to watch very closely.
Yes, indeed. But at the same time, speculate, from your knowledge, how do you think Italy should behave in this situation? How should this, as you said, it's an act of balancing. Don't upset the Chinese, but at the same time show Americans that you have their back and that you are loyal and you are a trustworthy ally. How do you think is Meloni going to do that?
I think it's a really difficult balancing
That's
act.
a difficult question.
I mean, it is, because I mean, what we've also seen is that, Italy hasn't really benefited that greatly economically from its involvement in the Belt and Road Initiative. Chinese imports in Italy have gone up over the last few years, but much more so than Italian exports to China. So what we're clearly seeing is a continuous issue with things like market access, with things like economic reciprocity. And those are things that I think Italy has to take very seriously, especially as it takes over leadership of the G7 next year. And it tries, as we are seeing, to play a much greater leadership role, not just within the Mediterranean region, but within Europe more broadly. And I think an overdependence on China, which we don't see, I think, with Italy, let's be clear about that. But I think if we get into that conversation about what a continued relationship with China through the Belt and Road Initiative might look like, it might decrease, I think, Italy's ability to be seen as a strategic leader as it wants to be. And so I don't have a clear answer as to what I think Meloni should do. I think there's probably a clear sense that the MOU, I would, if I had to put money on it, I would say it won't be renewed, just based on the conversations that have already been had, based on the role that Meloni's government wants to play in this region. But as the US, as I mentioned, has stayed largely silent up until now. If the decision of Italy doesn't become clear, I do think we'll see a greater diplomatic push by the United States to sort of pull Italy to the side of the West. It's interesting because the US relationship with Europe is obviously, the key economic and security relationship to the US. But as I mentioned before, countering China and revitalizing the US economy is very much the strategic focus. And so it's interesting to see how that lens has sort of shaped the way that the United States has decided to engage with its European partners over the last 18 months. And Italy is no exception to that.
Very well. Yeah, I agree. Thank you, Rachel. I will now go to Roberto again and ask the same question I asked to Rachel. There is a balancing act that Italy is doing with the United States and with its own allies, to make sure that their interests, especially they look toward the south, are covered and are understood. How do you see the Meloni coming here and trying to present to the Americans as a strategy that would help the Americans help Italy balance the situation in Europe and have the Europeans look more to the south than they're doing now?
Let me start with just a very short comment on the MOU with China. I agree with Rachel that I think that desperately, the government, the Italian government, is desperately trying to find a way out of the MOU. But of course, we know very well, and it's been said to us very clearly by the Chinese government, that there will be retaliation of some sort. Of course, it will be a trade thing, but it may affect some companies very directly. Some, a few Italian companies at least. So what I would expect is that the Meloni government will try to have a chat with the US government even before the push comes that you were mentioning, as we get closer to the deadline in, I guess, in the fall, by the end of the year, and try to extract some form of compensation, let's say, from the United States in various forms, more or less formal, more or less open to the public, by clarifying that we're going to pay a price for this. Now, on the other hand, to complete the picture, we have to remember that the Draghi government already, and Meloni has confirmed this approach, they've activated the golden power rule, whereby essentially the agreement is completely moot. It's an empty shell. So that's one of the reasons why, as you were rightly saying, Rachel, nothing really changed in terms of any specific benefit that we got from the deal with China. So it's a very strange situation. But to make it clear, from my own perspective, it's been a huge mistake. Since so far we have been rather diplomatic on this one, but I think it's been a very big mistake on the part of the previous Italian government. Now, having said that, going back to Karim's more general question, I think the current government in Rome is trying to actually strike a very delicate balance. For example, in the case of the Mattei Plan, I agree. So far, it's a bit vague. It's more like a general framework to deal with issues that are very different from each other, vis-a-vis not only North Africa, but Africa as a whole, because energy is the classical issue where we would find an analogy with the Mattei approach. I mean, the original one, let's say the historical Mattei approach. But this is broader than that, apparently, as far as we know. And it really has to involve the EU. So we go back to an issue that you have raised earlier, I think Alessia, Karim, all of you, in one way or another, and Dario as well. I mean, there has to be ways in which Italy can be a force for change and can actually take the initiative. Yes, no doubt, but we should never fall in what I would call the French trap, the French syndrome of basically arguing, I'll go anyway. Now, if you want to follow me, fine. If not, I'm still going. Now, the problem with the French is they're coming back. They're really coming back. They haven't really achieved significant results, especially in the Sahel, which is a problem from hell, of course. So it's not the French fault only. It's a structural issue there. But one of their faults, I think, and I'm speaking specifically of the French, is they have rarely tried to actually engage the other Europeans from the start. I mean, there has to be preventive coordination, not ex post. I mean, like I'm going in and then we'll see, because that's exactly what usually damages European interests. And I think Dario also said something similar in a way or another, speaking of other specific cases. I think Egypt, for example, is a problem that I think should be approached in a similar way in the future, because I agree with everything that's been said. Egypt is a big one. Algeria could be another big issue. And there's no way that one country or a collection of individual national policies can actually address something that big. So there has to be an EU effort. I understand it's very hard. It's very hard. And it's very, in a way, almost ironic that we're expecting this from a government like the Meloni government, with the history of its leader, Meloni herself, who has been very vocal against the EU, especially when she was on the other side of the, sitting on the other side of the table. But now I think a much more pragmatic approach is prevailing, I think, fortunately. And I hope and I expect that there will be more of this approach. So you take the initiative, but then you bring the others with you from the start on a common plan of action. And that's true with Libya, that's true with Morocco, Algeria, that's true with Egypt, and it could be true with East Med, for example, developing resources in the East Mediterranean, another very big opportunity for the future. One last point. I think one danger that I see is for the Italian government to use as a general overarching framework for our policy vis-a-vis not only North Africa, but also Africa as a whole, the immigration challenge. Now, migration and, of course, immigration from our perspective from Africa is indeed a big, very complex question. I understand that any government will need to face that reality, and there's no easy way out for anybody. But having said that, I really hope they will not make that the framework into which every other policy will be sort of inserted, because that will make it impossible to deal with a number of other issues. I mean, frankly, immigration is not the main challenge we face, if only because we need immigrants, by the way. But of course, I know there's a big debate on what kinds of immigrants, what way, how do you face and combat the kind of illegal immigration flows and so on. That's all granted and understood. But the problem is the debate cannot start from the immigration challenge. It has to end there. It has to be one of the results of a series of policies. And I hope they will go in that direction as we move forward. And let me stop. Oh, just one final point. That's almost a provocation. You know, there's this issue of trying to work to favor stability. Now, let's be careful there, because I think all of you, in a way or another, have alluded to this. I mean, stability should not be an end in itself. What we now have, for example, in Egypt, may be stable or not, I don't know, but it's not exactly a constellation of political, economic dynamics that I think is very healthy for Egypt itself. So let's make sure we don't confuse, we don't get confused. Stability is not an end in itself. It is a means to achieve certain other goals, because that's exactly the mistake we made in 2011, actually, on the way to 2011. I mean, analytical mistake before making the policy decisions. Thanks.
But this leads me to another conclusion. Are they doing that? I mean, is this action that they did towards Tunisia show the understanding of what you're saying, or is it a repetition of the same? Because it's very subtle. A lot of opposition over there, they're doing the same mistake. They're paying the Tunisians to keep the immigrant inside and go to the same old meaning. And even when Meloni and Tajani said, oh, the only solution to the problem of immigration is that we have to invest in their country so that they remain there. This is a blatant banality, because we haven't been able to develop Calabria, Molise. How are we going to develop the Burkina Faso or Niger? It's a truism that doesn't mean anything. So both Dario and Alessia, I know you have studied a lot of immigration and the political issue around it. What do you think about how is the government going? How is this Piano Mattei so far just a few words and no? The first time they had to act in a certain way, they acted in the old way. We're talking about the case of Tunisia. We'll first with Alessia, and then we pass to Dario.
Piano Mattei is something that is on the making, okay? So is an attempt to launch, and of course need a lot of work to decline the characteristics and the main point. So I think that Tunisia is a first attempt to create a possible collaboration or enhance traditional links, traditional ties with this country, and of course an attempt to find a possible solution for the problem of migration, because as Roberto and also Dario said, migration in any case is not the main problem, but of course is a real problem, an evident problem also for Italy. There are a lot of problems that remain in this MOU with Tunisia, of course, because it's not easy to think to create this possible deal MOU with a country that has now a president that have some claims, some racist claims, and some statements that are very complicated to absorb, to consider. So, of course, is an attempt and a possible way to solve. The problem is the same, stability. I agree with Roberto. Stability is not the solution, of course, but I think that when we speak about Egypt, but also in this case, when we speak about Tunisia, we need to think about the possibility to maintain a sort of economical stability, if you want, or not in the same, not stability in the sense of pre-2011 period, okay? So when stability was a sort of imperial order, okay? Stability versus democracy, something like this. No, but there is a need now to achieve a sort of economical stability in these countries, and I think, for example, about Egypt and Tunisia, just to give you an example. So, in conclusion, and I give the floor to Dario, I think that this is just an attempt, and there is a need to do something in respect to a country like Tunisia, and to another example, for example, to another country like Egypt, if you want.
Dario, what do you think?
Coming from southern Italy, I do see your point about the failure of the Italian state in, and how it would be difficult to do something like that in other countries. Well, on this, I think Roberto, what he said about Egypt was actually what I wanted to say to conclude my point earlier about the fact that we shouldn't really search stability per se, or like a stability that comes as a result of a heavy autocratic means, because in that case, as we have seen in the past, it might be short-sighted, etc. And then once the stability has gone, problems might be even more significant than we thought. The Piano Mattei, as I said, it's in the making. Let's not forget that Italy, especially the yellow-red government with the Five-Star Movement and the Democratic Party launched like a new framework for approaching for the partnership with Africa, I think in December 2020, if I'm not wrong. And that, from this point of view, especially with the Minister Lorenzo Guerini, there was a significant attention to actually merge together the Mediterranean dimension and the African dimension from a point of view of security. So as I said, I think the Mattei Plan has in itself, in its like name, has this principle of mutual agency, shared partnership, and that it should be something imposed. But now it's like it should be, there should be more than just that. Like, I think a global, let's say, comprehensive approach, this word is very abused in our sector, but it's inevitable. But at the same time, like, a plan for Africa should take into consideration the extremely diversified landscape that we have on the continent. And also, let's not forget that there are many African cities, etc., that are extremely dynamic. So in those cases, the problems they face are completely different from rural areas. So from this point of view, like a plan of shared agency with African partners should also be tuned, focusing on the actual local realities and try to find tailored solutions depending on the things that needs to be addressed. And from this point of view, I cannot agree more that migration shouldn't be the starting point, and also that we should make an effort to desecuritize a little bit this issue, because otherwise we remain trapped in this, vicious circle of seeing migration as a security problem.
Okay, but the issue is there. So we have exhausted the time at our disposal. But before setting you free to go to yourself, I have to ask you this very detailed question. I mean, not that particular. Meloni is coming here. Is their behavior bringing the Dutch and the President of the Commission to Tunis, the signing of the Tunisian MOU, according to you, God's feelings, is it something that she can come here and present as a success, or not? Or is it something that it's not as good as we were hoping it was? Start with Roberto, and then we go to Rachel, Alisa, and last time.
Well, in 10 seconds, yes, I think she will try to present it as a success. And I think it's a move in the right direction in the limited sense that I mentioned earlier. It's the methodology, I think, is correct, that you try to bring with you other countries plus the institutions. So in that sense, in that limited sense, I think it's a good attempt. It's creative, it's pragmatic, and it goes in the right direction. In terms of the practical goal of the agreement and the substance of the MOU, I agree with what's been said. It's very limited. It's a bit old-fashioned, Karim, as you were basically arguing. It's old-fashioned in the sense that it only focuses on one element of a much more complex problem. You have to start from somewhere. I understand that. It's almost like an emergency measure. I don't think it's a long-term strategy, however. So yes, it will be presented that way, but it will be a tough sell, not just in Washington, I think, but also across Europe.
Thank you. Rachel?
So I think taking a little bit of a broader look at this, because I think the other panelists are probably better suited to talk about the substance of the MOU. Remember what happened after Meloni was elected in Italy. Biden literally used her election as a warning to Democrats in the US. Okay, so you have to think about how Meloni's win was viewed here in the United States and what she has done over the last 8 months to try to not necessarily assuage those concerns, but show not just actors in Europe, but the US too, that this is maybe where Europe is heading. If Biden and his team think that the Meloni election was concerning, look at what's happening in other countries as well. Is Europe moving to this sort of more protectionist, nationalistic bend? And is Meloni the leader that is at the forefront of that? So I think anything that she can do to sort of show her policy chops and show some of the agreements that she's been able to sign over the last 6 or 7 months or so as a win, as an example to the Biden administration, is exactly what her team is going to come here and do.
Excellent. Alessia?
I agree with Roberto, and because I think is the right way to operate. So try to gather a group of actors and propose and create this sort of new collaboration MOU. What I think is a need to avoid is specifically the risk to reply again the border externalization. It is something that, in my opinion, need to be avoided. That is to say, to give money to these countries and give them the role to control the frontiers. No, this is something that, in my opinion, we need to avoid, and we try to create something to help them to collaborate with the control of the borders. So is a good idea, is a right idea, and in my opinion is a, yes, maybe old-fashioned model, but in any case something that is can try to do. But what I think we should avoid is to apply this mistake of border externalization.
I think in DC can be sold the idea that European countries can get together with the European institutions to find solutions, although like the MOU with Tunisia to me doesn't really look like anything close like to a potential solution to the problems we are facing. From that point of view, I think that the priority for everyone should be now to avoid that Tunisia goes bankrupt. And then after that, we start from that element to move ahead with all the rest. But I think the immediate priority should be that one.
Okay, so it's a good first step. I'd like to thank you, all of you, very much. Thanks also to our listener and to our invitees. Thanks a lot, guys. It's been very interesting. This is just the first of many things that we have. I'm planning to follow the actions of the Italian government and this, but the unveiling of the Mattei Plan very closely. So I will resort on your expertise and on your availability and your capabilities many more times. Thank you very much for all, and ad maiore.
Thanks a lot.